Hi guys, welcome back. I believe this is week 5 of online learning. The end is in sight. Next weekend is going to be this coming weekend is going to be May, and that means we only have about 4 weeks left, and then we should be finished for the year because we finish on June 3rd. So from this weekend, it's only 4 more weeks. You've got a month. You're almost there. You can do this, right? So this week, we're going to be talking about some of the wartime atrocities that occurred during World War II. This is kind of a difficult topic. It's very sad and it's very depressing, to be honest with you. But I still think that everybody should learn about the terrible things that happened to people during World War II so that it never happens again in the future. So today, what we'll be talking about are wartime atrocities that happened in China during World War II at the hands of the Japanese, and of course, the Holocaust in Germany that occurs during World War II. So what do we want to take away from this? First, we're going to hash out a definition of genocide. What exactly this word means, you should know, and it should become part of your vocabulary, especially within the context of this course. We'll start by talking about Nanjing, which is in China, and what happened in Nanjing in 1937, and how the Japanese justified their behavior, their actions. How did the Nazis, quote unquote, deal with Jews prior to the final solution? I know deal with is not the best choice of words here, but I couldn't think of an alternative phrase. Basically, how did Nazis treat Jews before what they call the final solution? What circumstances led to the Nazis' final solution? And we'll talk about what the final solution actually is. But, what were the circumstances that led the Nazis to come up with this plan of genocide of Jews and other, quote unquote, undesirables, as we'll see. What was the other Holocaust? Most of the time when we talk about the Holocaust, it's usually in reference to the death of millions of Jewish people. But it wasn't only Jewish people who died at the hands of Nazi genocide. Like we said, there were other races of people that the Nazis identified as lesser people. And they also suffered and died in concentration and death camps, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, the Nuremberg trials. At the end of the war, the Allies do come up with this trial system to try and bring some people to justice. These are known as the Nuremberg trials. So what was the goal and the significance of the Nuremberg trials? Why were they important? So let's start out this topic of wartime atrocities by giving a definition to genocide, right? If we break it down to the roots, genos comes from Greek and it means a race or a people. Kidere comes from Latin. It means to kill. So we've got kind of mixed Greek and Latin roots here. So it's basically, Raphael Lemkin defines it as, quote, a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. So in other words, it's the targeting of a national group and undermining their way of life with the goal of destroying that group. So genocide, we can say simply, is the destruction of a race or a national group. If we were in class, normally we would do some brainstorming about where else there have been genocides in history, and I'm sure you can think of some. American students, obviously what was done to the Native Americans in both North and South America during the European colonization of the 15 and 1600s. There are almost no natives today. We could talk about the Armenian genocide, where the Ottomans murdered, several millions of Armenians in Anatolia, which the Turkish government still denies to this day. Unfortunately, in the mid-90s, there was a genocide in the African country of Rwanda. So it's not a particularly 21st century phenomenon. We've seen genocidal acts throughout history. So let's talk about what we call today the Rape of Nanjing, or the Rape of Nanking, which happened in 1937. Part of this week's assignment is going to be a primary doc in which you'll read about what the Japanese actually did to Chinese civilians and soldiers in Nanjing in 1937. So when we talk about the Rape of Nanjing, what does that actually mean? We said that when Japan invaded China in 1937, we called this the Second Sino-Japanese War, and later this becomes shifted into World War II. Um, and the Japanese were successful in capturing most of the territory of northeastern China, cities like Beijing, Shanghai, although that's not northeastern. Um, no, thank you for the update. Um, but one of the capital cities of China has traditionally been Nanking. Um, and when the Japanese army reached Nanking, they set about destroying the city and its population. Um, we call it the Rape of Nanjing because what the Chinese citizens experienced at the hands of the Japanese soldiers was indeed mass rape. About 20,000 women were raped and killed as a result of the Japanese overcoming the city. Mass murder, too. 60,000 civilians were killed, 50,000 POWs, which means prisoners of war. So these were Chinese soldiers that had been captured. And this is a significant number of people. And arson, of course, a third of the city was destroyed by fire. Some images, if you're squeamish, you might want to fast forward a little bit. But these are some of the images that show the actions of the Japanese in Nanjing. We can see the Japanese soldiers here. They've cut the heads off all of these Chinese people. I don't know how many heads that is. It's over 50 people who have been decapitated here. Unfortunately, photos like this serve to kind of foment this continuing anger of the Chinese towards the Japanese today. Bayonet practice, where babies were thrown up and stuck onto bayonets, which is the knife on the end of the rifle. But what are some of the consequences of this? Well, the Japanese officials there were some Japanese officials that were tried for war crimes after the war. Now, 6 were sentenced to death and only 18 were jailed. And you think, oh, well, that's a really low number. It is, unfortunately. Most people did escape justice for the terrible things they did to the Chinese during this time period. And as we'll see, in one of the primary documents this week, basically what the primary document does and goes and talks to Japanese soldiers who participated in it, and they say, yeah, I killed babies and boiled them alive and everything. So we'll look at that. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But there's a debate even today between China and Japan about the death toll. The Chinese tend to, they say, the Chinese said, oh, there was this many people that died. And the Japanese say, no, that's a lie. That's inflated. There weren't that many people who died. Some Japanese people deny that this even happened, that it's some type of propaganda created by the Chinese government in order to stir up anger against the Japanese. It did happen for sure. But unfortunately, even today, there's still debate about whether it happened or how many people actually died, and between Japan and China. But I think the question out of all of this is why. This part, I mean, I don't really describe the rape of Nanking a lot here in the lesson, because I think that the primary document that's part of the assignment does a really good job of kind of provoking the reader to think about why this happened. Like, why did the Japanese feel the need to murder and rape all of these innocent people in the most terrible and brutal way? What was wrong with these soldiers who did that? And that's something that we'll think about, or you should think about, as you read one of the primary docs this week about the rape of Nanking. Let's move over to Europe and we'll talk about the Holocaust. And we'll talk about the background of the Holocaust. So it's important to note, if we think about Adolf Hitler's racial ideology, remember, Hitler wanted to create a German empire that was based on race, in which there were only pure-blooded Germans. And this was outlined in his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which he wrote while he was in prison after being arrested for the beer hall putsch. So Hitler for a long time has had a vision of a racial a German society based on race. However, at first, Hitler did not advocate for genocide of Jewish people. He just wanted them out of Germany. So, we have Hitler's ideology. Of course, as you should know by now, there's Aryans, which are pure Germans, and there are Jews, and Jews are, of course, Hitler blames the Jews for many of Germany's problems, and believes that there should be, no Jewish influence in German society. Hitler and the Nazis refer to not only Jews but also Slavic people, meaning people from Poland and Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, all of those people who speak a language related to Russian. Jews, Slavs, Gypsies or Roma, as they're supposed to be called nowadays, and Black Africans are all referred to as Untermenschen or lesser races. It literally means like lower people. So anybody who's not Aryan, according to Hitler, is Untermenschen, and they have no place in a future German empire. If you remember, I think this was before Easter break or spring break, the Nazis established the Nuremberg laws, which basically legalized anti-Semitism. And if you recall the Nuremberg laws, it took away German citizenship if you were Jewish. It forbade Jewish people from practicing the major professions like being lawyers, doctors, civil servants. And also it prevented it banned marriage between Germans and Jews, as well as at what the Nuremberg laws quote as, quote, gypsies, Negroes, and their bastards. So after the passage of the Nuremberg laws, there's no marriage between Germans, Aryan Germans, and non-Aryan Germans, right? So it's really after 1935 that the Nazis legalized anti-Semitism. And the goal here is to make life so difficult to live as a Jewish person in Germany that they leave Germany, right? And indeed, many people do this. Albert Einstein was one of them who left Germany during this time period and went to America. There were indeed millions of German Jews who got out early based on this unfair treatment by the Nazis. For a while, I just kind of mentioned this because I think it's kind of bizarre and odd. For a while there, Hitler and the Nazis, they had, according to them, what according to them was a problem, a Jewish problem. And the Nazis said, well, we have all these Jewish people in German society and we don't want them. What do we do with them? And for a while, the Nazis actually toyed with the idea of putting all the Jews on a boat and just sending them to Madagascar. Of course, this is impossible. You can't do this. It costs too much money. It's inhumane, obviously. But probably the primary obstacle to this Madagascar plan of the Nazis is that Madagascar is actually a French colony at this time. So the Nazis did actually think about sending all the Jews to Madagascar, but that wasn't a feasible plan in the long run. Now, when the war breaks out, when Hitler invades Poland in 1939, large numbers of Germans moved to Poland because, remember, this was part of Hitler's goal, was to create Lebensraum, or living space, for Aryan Germans in the new German Empire. So Hitler, and he's looking towards Eastern Europe and Russia, the Soviet Union, for that. So as the Nazis expand east, the reason why Hitler is doing this, presumably, so he says, is to create living space to give land to Aryan Germans to live so he can create this new racially based German empire, right? However, Hitler has a problem because Poland has a large Jewish population, as does much of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So as Hitler annexes Poland, and basically adds Poland to German territory, he also increases his Jewish population, which is exactly what the Nazis don't want, right? So let's talk about ghettos. We'll do a little etymology here. You don't have to know this. Well, maybe you do. But the word ghetto itself comes from Italian, and it could either mean foundry, which is... The first ghetto was founded on the site of a foundry in Venice. A foundry is a place where they melt iron and metal, or it could come from the Italian borgo, which means like a borough or a district of a town. Borghetto is like a little district, so it could have just chopped off the borg, and you have the ghetto. but it's an Italian word in origin, and ghettos had been around in European cities for hundreds of years. Indeed, if you visit a major European city today, a large one such as Rome or Prague in the Czech Republic, you can actually still visit some of the areas, the ghettos, the Jewish areas, because let's not forget, for a long time, almost all of European history, Jews were ostracized. They were not welcome in mainstream Christian society. So they were often forced to live in a certain area of a city. And these areas took on the name of ghetto. As the Nazis expand east into Poland, what they do is they create special areas of the city for Jews, and it basically becomes like a city prison in a certain way. Jews are brought from all over Germany to ghettos in Poland. So this is the beginning of the quote, what the Nazis call, quote, the final solution. If before you were a Jewish person living in Germany, after the invasion of Poland, Poland has all this space now that they can relocate Jews to. So if you were a Jewish family living in Germany, you would get a knock on the door from the SS, the Schutzstaffel, the secret police, and they would say, "Pack a bag, you're moving." So ghettos in Poland had already existed because Poland is a mostly Catholic country, and what the Germans started doing is forced relocation of Jews into those ghettos. Now you can imagine if you take a small area of a city and you force thousands of people to go live there. They were crowded, which means they were dirty with lots of garbage. They were poor. There was no sewage. It was difficult to get food. And usually it was sectioned off by brick walls or barbed wire fences. Here's the ghetto in the city of Łódź in Poland. And the sign behind the woman here says, this is the Jewish living area. Entry is forbidden. And you can see the fence there. The people are behind the fence. And there is, of course, an armed guard there to make sure that nobody goes in or comes out of that Jewish living area. Wohngebiet der Juden. Now, the Nazis have a problem because their expansionist ideology is a racial one. So as the Nazis expand into Poland and later on with Operation Barbarossa into the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as the Nazis annex more territory, what they get is a higher Jewish population because, like we said, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union has a significant Jewish population. So it's kind of a circular problem for the Nazis. The more territory they add, the larger their Jewish population is. And there are only so many ghettos that they can force Jewish people to live in. So what about forced immigration? What about making everybody leave? Well, that's not really feasible either because the Nazis need their shipping ports and railways for sending war supplies. This is a country at war, both in the west and in the east of the country. So the fact that we have a war going on makes forcing Jewish people to leave the country impossible. So here, enter Heinrich Himmler. Here he is. He's evil. He's the head of the SS, and he's the designer of what the Nazis called the final solution, right? And in 1942, the Nazis get together in a place called Wannsee, and they have a conference in which they finalize the implementation of the what they call the final solution to the Jewish question. Because this is how the Nazis would talk. They say, well, this is a Jewish question. And how do we answer the Jewish question? Well, the final solution. And of course, by the final solution, they mean the extermination, the genocide of Jewish people within German territory. So in 1942, the Nazis get together during the Wannsee Conference, and they basically create a plan for all of Nazi-occupied territory to deport Jewish people either to work camps or death camps. Most of the death camps were in Poland. The first ones created were Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, or Oswiecim in Polish. And after some experimentation, the Nazis determined that the most efficient way to murder large numbers of people is by poison gas. And they the chemical Zyklon B, which is a copper-based pesticide. It's used for killing bugs on crops um, to to murder people. They tested on Russian POWs. You remember there were 2 million Soviet soldiers that were captured as a result of Operation Barbarossa. Here's the entrance to Auschwitz. This something iconic sign you can see. It still exists there today. When you visit Auschwitz, it says "Arbeit macht frei." It means, the best English translation is "work makes you free." But of course, the harder if you went to Auschwitz, you knew you weren't coming out. Work does not make you free. So the Nazis would forcibly deport Jews to death camps. And, I'm sure everybody has seen some type of Holocaust movie or something where you have the trains arriving at the camps and you have all these people packed in box cars, train cars, and, they're pulling the people off of the train cars. And when the Jewish prisoners arrived at the extermination camps or the work camps, Nazi doctors would go through, they would separate the men and women in lines, and the doctors would go through and choose those who were strong enough, quote, fit for work, which was about 25% of the people. And then the other people, like the weaker, the older adults and women and children, were often sent to the showers for what the Nazis called delousing. Of course, we know the showers were not for delousing. One louse is like one bug. It's a singular of lice. So maybe you've had lice before, or you knew somebody had lice. Usually little kids get it. It's those little bugs in your hair, and your hair is really itchy because if you've been on a train car with 50 other people for the past 3 days, it spreads bugs and disease. So the Nazis said, well, we're going to send you to the shower because you're dirty, and we're going to get the lice, the bugs out of your hair, basically. But we know that that's not what the showers were used for. The showers, well, let's look at the quote first. This is Rudolf Höss, and he's the commandant. He runs Auschwitz death camp. And one of the primary documents this week for your assignment is his testimony at the Nuremberg trials. And Rudolf Höss says, we had 2 SS doctors who would make sought-on decisions as the prisoners walked by. So basically, the doctors would look at watch the prisoners walk by, and they would decide whether they were fit or not. It says those fit for work were sent to the work camp, he means. Others were sent immediately to the extermination camp. Children of tender years, very young children, were exterminated since by reason of their youth they were unable to work. At Auschwitz, we endeavored to fool the victims into thinking that they were to go through a delousing process. Of course, frequently they realized our true intentions, and we sometimes had riots and difficulties due to that fact. So basically, the people who were to be murdered, they told them, "Oh, you're going to be deloused. You're going to the shower." But people often figured it out, and there was a panic, and people would freak out. Obviously, you can imagine if so they tell you you're going in a shower, but you realize that shower is going to be your last shower. People would freak out. Now, the reason why the Nazis used showers was because, first of all, of this excuse to kind of keep people to remain calm, thinking that they were going to have a shower. But when you add this poison to hot water, the steam that comes from a hot shower turns the little pellets, the little pieces of poison into a gas, and then the people who are in the shower inhale this gas. So they would add these little pellets, these little pieces of poison to the shower. The steam would create a gas, and unfortunately, this was a long and painful death for everyone who experienced it, because it felt like all of your skin was burning, your eyes, your nose, your lungs were burning, and sometimes it took up to 20 minutes for people to die. Sometimes the showers were so crowded that most of the dead were usually found squatting because there was so many people in there wasn't room to fall over dead. They just kind of collapsed on their knees, unfortunately. You can still visit Auschwitz today. Here is one of the showers of the gas chambers. As I mentioned, the poison itself is copper based, which is why you see some of those blue stains on the wall. Really, really terrible, evil, undescribable evil. Um, After the Nazis had murdered their victims, they usually took everything they could off their bodies of value. For example, eyeglasses, hair, and gold fillings were removed from the bodies. Obviously, people used to use gold to fill their teeth. So the Nazis would take out the gold and they would melt down that gold to create gold bars from the teeth of their victims. Hair, rings, jewelry. I mean, look at all the rings here in the box. You can imagine how many people you have to murder to get that many rings. It's despicable. And then the bodies were removed and cremated in ovens. And then obviously the ashes from all those bodies that were burned in ovens were used for fertilizer or for crops or dumped in rivers. So I hate to say it, but if you have eaten anything grown in a German or Polish field at some point, then you probably are eating food that was once grown in a field that was fertilized by the human victims of the Nazis' remains. Hair. This is a lot of hair. The Nazis, they shaved the head, and this is how many. Look at the. I just want to draw your attention to the bags. If you look in the upper left corner, it says 26 kilos, and then below that, 19 and a half kilos of hair. So each of those bags are about 50 pounds, 22 kilos of hair, 20 and a half kilos. Each of these bags, this is about 200, 300 pounds of hair. And the saddest thing in the middle there is you can see the braids of some little girl, most likely. And you know how light hair is. In order to get 200 pounds of hair, how many people do you have to murder and shave their head to get 200 pounds of hair? It's disturbing to think about. And you might think, why? Why did the Nazis want the hair? Well, hair was actually a pretty good industrial material for many of the war purposes of Nazis. The Nazis would use the hair for stuffing in like automobile seats. Hair could also be pressed together to make a fabric called felt that could be used to make almost like woolen boots or socks for soldiers. Any type of upholstery, filling, cushions, things like that. The word crosshair itself, if you think about a rifle with a scope, if you look through the scope, there's a little cross in there. It's called a crosshair because originally it was made of hair. Blonde hair was favorite for using crosshair, creating crosshairs because blonde hair was more transparent than darker hair. This is Mauthausen-Gusen in Austria, what's today Austria, and here we can see prisoners are awaiting disinfection. So these are new arrivals, and they will be either sent to the showers to meet their end, or they will be taken off to the work camp to be worked until their death. The Nazis also we can't understate the fact that the Nazis, they murdered millions of Jewish people based on racial ideology, but they didn't murder everybody because the Nazi war machine was dependent upon slave labor. They needed those prisoners to build ammunition and to create things that were needed for the war effort. At the same time, the Nazis were using, as if, how do I put this? If you have people that you're treating like animals, then there's no medical ethics anymore. And the Nazis were very interested in scientific progress. So if you have now human subjects that you don't view as human, it's very easy for the Nazis to say, oh, well, look at all of these subjects we have that we can expose to medical experimentation. And what type of medical experiments are we talking about? There were hundreds of SS doctors that conducted human experiments on on Jewish prisoners, but perhaps the most infamous is Joseph Mengele, who was called Dr. Death. He was the doctor at Auschwitz. Twins. The Nazis love twins. Why? Because if you're going to do an experiment, you always want to have a variable and a control. Twins are usually genetically identical, so you can have your control and you can also have your variable. What you do to one thing, you could it easily allows you to see what the effect would be, and you have the twin was the control. Bone. We're talking about bone, muscle, nerve transplant experiments, all without anesthesia, meaning no painkillers. The Nazis often would try and take an arm off of one prisoner and put them on another. A lot of them had to do with survival experiments. Did I write survival experiments? Head injury experiments, survival experiments specifically. For example, how long can a human be in ice cold water before they freeze to death? And after they freeze to death, can we bring them back to life? If you're interested in this subject and how America benefited from this, then I recommend the book Operation Paperclip by Annie Jacobson. Just downright chilling and terrible what the Nazis did. And then most of the scientists were later kidnapped by the U.S. government so we could create our own pharmaceutical advances and biological chemical weapons programs. Survival experiments. So, for example, like I said, cold water immersion. How long can you be in cold water before you freeze to death? There's also pharmaceutical and chemical weapon experimentation. We have a new drug. Let's try out this new drug on all of these people. Head injury experiments. As I put here, how many times can you get hit in the head before you become brain dead or it kills you? Just really, well, imagine the darkest human experiment that you could conduct on somebody, and that the Nazis probably did it with many of these prisoners. Of course, we can never do that today because it's completely unethical. But the Nazis, they weren't worried about that because they viewed their prisoners as inhuman anyway. So, for example, here, a compression chamber is basically a giant tube where you can remove the air. And here we have a prisoner in a compression chamber. He loses consciousness and then he later dies, obviously, because what they're doing is they're taking the air slowly out of the chamber. And why are they doing that? Because they're trying to figure out at which altitude somebody in an airplane could survive without oxygen. Basically, how high can you go in an airplane without needing an oxygen, being connected to an oxygen mask before you pass out and die? Really, really terrible way to die. This map shows you all of the major Nazi camps across Europe during the war. If it's a solid black square, it's a work camp. If it's a little target-looking square, that's an extermination or a death camp. As you can see, most of them are in Poland. But almost every European, Central, Southern, Eastern European country today had some type of Nazi camp within it. If you have an opportunity while traveling through Europe one day, please visit one of these camps. I know that you can visit Auschwitz. I know you can visit Buchenwald. I myself have visited Buchenwald. It's outside of Weimar. It's very important that people go and visit these places so that you can understand how evil not just humans can be, but the state itself can be. And the purposes, of course, would be education to understand, not only this part of human history, but get the knowledge so that hopefully it will never happen again. Many prisoners were freed when the Soviets and the Americans and the British arrived in Germany. Here we can see it, the Ebensee camp, which is liberated by the Americans. They've colored this picture, but you can see how these people, you can see the bones, how they're almost starved to death. This map shows you the loss the percentage of the Jewish population that was lost as a result of the Holocaust in Europe. So we can see Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland, the Baltic states lost between 80 to 90% of their Jewish population. France and Italy between 2 and 34%. That seems like a pretty wide margin to me. Romania, Hungary, 35 to 59%. Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, the Soviet Union, between 60 and 79% of people. Of Jewish people were murdered by the Nazis as a result of this. So let's take a few moments to talk about the other Holocaust, because usually when we refer to the Holocaust, people tend to think of the systematic murder of Jewish people, and that is true. That did happen. About 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. This is the best guesstimate that historians can come up with. The Nazis were very detailed in their record making, but there, of course, we still can't be sure when you get in that high numbers of murder and genocide. Who can tell for sure? So about 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. However, 40% of European Roma, or they're also known as gypsies, were killed in death camps as well. The Holocaust also extended to Slavic people, Polish people, Ukrainian people, Belarusians, Soviets, even if they weren't Jewish. Remember, the Nazis, they believed that the Aryan Germans were the ultimate race, and there was no room in the new empire for Untermenschen or lesser races, which of course included Polish people, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Roma, and Jews. Soviet prisoners of war. If we talk about those Soviet soldiers who were captured during Operation Barbarossa, they were probably the first victims of the Holocaust. This is how the Nazis perfected their killing method, was by experimenting on Soviet soldiers that were captured. The mentally ill, obviously, if you are creating a society that is based on not only a pure race, but healthy specimens of a pure race. You don't want many mentally ill people because you don't want them to breed and ruin the racial foundation of your society. So, of course, the Nazis murdered about 9,000 of their own mentally ill people. Nothing, they were regular Germans, but they, in some way, were autistic or on the spectrum, or maybe had cerebral palsy or something like that. Homosexuals as well. There was no room in Nazi Germany for homosexuals, so there were about 10,000 homosexuals who were sent off to their deaths at the concentration camp or death camp. And if we do the math and add up all of the non-Jewish people who were killed by the Nazis, this includes political prisoners, homosexuals, mentally ill, what the Nazis classified as Untermenschen, that were non-Jewish, Untermenschen, lesser races, Poles, Ukrainians, Soviets. There were about almost as many non-Jews were murdered by the Nazis as were Jewish people. So always remember that when we talk about the Holocaust, we're not only talking about the genocide of Jewish people, but the genocide of other races and people who the Nazis deemed lesser or inadequate. Okay, so is there any justice for this? I mean, I think one of the questions that persists even into the 21st century is, how do you murder 11 million people? Can you get justice for murdering 11 million people at all? And that's what the Nuremberg trials attempted to do after the war. So when the war was over and the Nazis had been defeated by the Allies, and the Allies found out what the Nazis were doing in these death camps and these labor camps, they set up a series of trials to try and hold some of these people who were responsible accountable. Now, many people escaped justice, unfortunately. Hitler committed suicide or escaped to Argentina, if you hold that belief. There were other people who also escaped to Argentina, Nazis. And Goebbels, his propaganda minister, committed suicide. There were many of the high, top level Nazis who were responsible. Himmler, who designed the Holocaust, basically, he committed suicide. There were many top level Nazis who did escape justice because they committed suicide. They killed themselves. However, there were also people involved that were captured by the Allies or they surrendered. So how do you get justice? How do you find out who was responsible for this and who wasn't? That was the goal of the Nuremberg trials. The Nazis were that the higher up Nazi officials were tried for war crimes. Here we can see in the court we've got American soldiers guarding some of these Nazi prisoners that are on trial, and these are called the Nuremberg trials because they happened in the German city of Nuremberg, which was somewhat symbolic because Nuremberg was a popular location for the Nazis to hold rallies for supporters. So the Allies holding these trials of Nazis for war crimes in Nuremberg, which is basically the home of Nazi pride, was symbolic for Germany at the time. Like I said, Hitler and his right-hand man Himmler, the head of the SS, they both escaped justice by committing suicide. Now, in the end, 10 Nazi officials are executed, 7 are put in prison, 3 are acquitted, which means, hey, there's not enough evidence, you go free, and 2 of them were not tried, right? And you would think, how is it possible that millions of people are killed because of the Nazis, and they only find 17 people that were guilty of all this? It leaves one to wonder. You must be shaking your head right now. And even what's the point of the trial if they're not going to be able to get all these Nazis? What about the Joe Sixpack Nazi who was just a guard in the camp? Why wasn't he on trial? Right? Even today, guys, even most of World War II veterans are dead or dying. There are still organizations committed to finding those Nazis who have been hiding all of their life because they were a 19-year-old guard or something like that, and bringing them the trial. So you might think, what's the point? Well, the point is that it creates the concept of war crimes. This idea that there are certain things that you can't do in war. It's not allowed, and you will be held responsible for unethical conduct in war. I think that's funny. It's war. I don't know what that means, but war crime. I mean, war itself is a crime. So I myself find the concept of war crimes to be ridiculous. But it creates this idea of war crimes. There are certain things in war that you can't do. But the main goal of the Nuremberg trials was not only to try and hold some of the Nazis that were responsible for the Holocaust to bring them to justice, but also to create a precedent of judicial power that was higher than national governments. So this idea that, hey, I'm Hitler, I run my German empire, and I can murder anybody I want. The idea behind the Nuremberg trials is, no, you can't. The international community is going to create a committee that's going to hold you responsible for genocide or, crimes against humanity or whatever. That even above the national level, you don't have absolute power. You will be tried and convicted and held responsible for any crimes you commit at the national level. But really, the main point of the Nuremberg trials is to deter against future war crimes or genocide. And you might think, how does a trial do that? Because it goes to show, for the future, the Nazis did these terrible things. They murdered millions of people, right? But the Nuremberg trials show that, hey, don't think that you can get away with murdering millions of people, because eventually you will get caught and we will put you on trial. We will find out who's responsible and you will be punished for the crimes that you commit. And that holds for future generations too. This idea that you people in the future who are thinking of genocide or war crimes or something like that, eventually we'll find you and we'll get you. So don't think about it in the future. The goal here was to send a message to future generations that you should not commit genocide or war crimes, because eventually you will pay the consequences for it. Okay? Listen, guys, thank you for your attention. I hope that you find this week's assignment and lesson insightful and you learned something from it. And I look forward to talking to everybody about it during office hours this week. If you have any questions, please come to office hours. And thank you so much for your time and attention.